Welcome everybody. Now, let's paint a picture. It's December 20th, 1903, and the Boston Sunday Post has just declared Sam Langford, right in the middle there, the lightweight champion of New England. Now, in 1902, he had had success, brief success as an amateur. He won a tournament at the Roanoke Club and also won as a special feature bout against Jack McVicker, the same gentleman he beat in the tournament. Now, he was living in the Lenox Club and cleaning it up and sparring, and he was getting help from Jimmy Walsh on there. And he was also getting help from Georgie Byers. And now Langford was Canadian, born in Nova Scotia, and he left an abusive household as a young teenager and worked his way down, ending up in Boston. And Georgie Byers was also Canadian, and Byers had been the middleweight and the heavyweight colored champion. And he was getting on a bit in the fight game by this time, but he was helping Langford. Langford credited him with teaching how to fight, putting his weight into his punches and snapping the left hook. And Langford was later famed for his right straight and his left hook, but his left hook, according to him, that was the real danger punch. Now, so Langford has Georgie Byers, Jimmy Walsh. He's at the Lenox Club, and the owner would later become his manager. And so he's just closed out 1903, almost. He's actually got one more fight to go before the end of the year. He's going to fight the great Jack Blackburn, who is most known today as Joe Louis's coach, but was a great fighter in his own right, a really brilliant master boxer who, fought a lot out of Philly, and actually, because of his style, was more defensively brilliant and more technical. The judges in Philly actually preferred more of a come-forward style, so he actually almost got punished a little bit at times in his career because of where he was based for his style. But he was just brilliant, and he trained a lot of world-class fighters, but Joe Louis is the most famous. That was his real protege. And in his day, Joe Louis was so good that, the question was, okay, so Sugar Ray Robinson was Joe Louis's size, could he beat Joe Louis? There was a question about that. We know how incredible Sugar Ray Robinson was. So, Blackburn, that was his main project, but he taught a lot of great fighters. And so, back in the day when he fought Langford in December, he was several years into his career, but he was almost undefeated, but he'd actually gotten the better of the great Joe Gans not long before this fight happened, over 6 rounds, I believe it was. And Langford, though this newspaper article credits him as the New England champion based on beating all the local lads, because Langford had 27 trips to the ring in 1903. He had one professional fight against his former amateur rival Jack McVicker as a pro. He turned pro against him in their third fight in 1902, and then he was booked for 2 other fights, but a hot summer and the death of a young man combined basically to set the gym back and the athletic club, and he, according to him later in his later memoirs, he moved, I think it was up to New Hampshire. He went back to New Hampshire, maybe logging or one of these, the manual labor that he, according to him, he kept losing these jobs for fighting on the job. He was born to fight. And so 1903 was really like the real kickoff point of his career, and he just stormed his way through. I mean, it's completely remarkable the speed with which he punched his way into prominence in sort of the pugilistic realm. And he did have a setback that year against an excellent New York lightweight, Danny Duane, who's very fast. And years later, in 1924, Langford published his memoirs in I think it was 35-piece, retrospective, that was syndicated, but it was for the Halifax Herald, and he credited Danny Dwayne as the fastest guy he ever fought. And so Dwayne did get the better of him. Apparently there was a side bet too. That was his first side bet fight, if I'm not mistaken, for I think it was $500, which was a large sum at the time. But the New York backers bet, I believe it was the owner of the, his backer, the owner of the gym, the owner of the Lenox. But anyway, just to give just a briefest sense, and I'm going to get into the full details on the FightCity.com series that I have coming up. But just to give, just to touch on the speed with which he just like became a somebody. He went from living in the gym the year before, amateur fight, but then left. His heart wasn't in it. He wasn't sure, I should say. But then, he just came storming out. So, he fought 3 times in January, he fought twice in February, he fought 3 times in March, and then he had 3 fights in April and 4 fights in May, and then 4 fights in June. And then, July, August, September, and October, he just fought once each. But then he had 2 fights in November and 2 fights in December. And the guys he's fighting here, they're not pushovers. They're not, they're all tough people. And some of them are also, good boxers or capable, either rising talents at that time or established people. But also in there is Joe Gans, who at the time, the momentum he had in his career, and he had been outpointed by Blackburn, who had a great record and was himself, emerging as a notable person. So some people interpreted Gans losing to him as Gans is slipping, but other people were like, hey, Jack Blackburn is serious. And then, and in retrospect, they were absolutely right. They very quickly, it was established that they were all fantastic fighters. This was a very rich time around lightweight and welterweight at this time. So Langford, that's, I didn't even mention any names, but that's like the kind of, that schedule he had was truly remarkable. But he kept an insane schedule throughout his career. It wasn't until the very end of his career, the last, I think 1925 and 26, that he only had a couple fights. But he was blind and just completely gone. He would never have been in the ring, these days. He wouldn't have been sanctioned. In fact, he probably wouldn't have been sanctioned after, 1917, when he got nerve damage in his eye from Fred Fulton, a very heavy puncher, just jabbed his eye to jelly. But Langford fought on. He had a huge number of fights after that. But anyway, we're way back in 1903. Langford's just a prospect. He won an amateur tournament. The Roanoke Club was respected. Barbados Walcott, who was the reigning welterweight champion, at the end of the year. And he's there as the New England champion, but he was also the world champion. Well, he had competed at the Roanoke Club himself. And so, in that sense, Langford was a prospect before his career kicked into full speed. But just to be clear, lots of fighters had lots of fights every year. Not every fighter, but generally, because it was the Livegate era, and to make money, you had to show up, you had to earn a purse. It wasn't like today where media just drives income so much. In this time, you had to fight. So lots of guys had lots of fights. So Langford making 27 trips to the ring in a year is pretty intense, but he didn't do that every year of his career. He had a great many fights. He had over 300 fights, known fights, and probably a whole bunch of others that just they either didn't make the papers, or when boxing was being persecuted, with legislation, they just weren't reported, or they happened in private. But he had over 300 fights between 1902 and 1926, and he did exhibitions after that, even when he was just blind. He was so good that late in his career, when he was blind in one eye and he had cataracts in the other, he was still very capable, very dangerous, and some fighters still gave them pause. the prospect of fighting him, even when he was just a shadow of his former all-time great self, he was still pretty damn good. But anyway, so in 1903, he's established himself, but he's done it in the manner that other boxers of that time would ideally do. You would fight all the local lads and do well, then you would fight some regional guys and do well, then fight the best of the local lads and continue to do well, then you would, within a couple years, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe you get to a title level, or you win a local or a state or a regional title, but like you work very quickly to get there. You don't spend 5 years not fighting anybody. It's much more rare in that time for people to just be piddling around. You want to get to it. You want to fight names, win or lose. Because you don't, in the newspapers at the time, you don't want to just be such and such. You want to be this guy who fought this guy, and so you're woven into the fabric of what was going on, because there was a lot of boxing happening, and it was a big deal to the fan base, which included some very rich, powerful people, as well as like your everyman, blue collar. But it was, it was very passionate fan base that would follow people out of the neighborhood to go support the guy, go town to town, and there were just an inordinate amount of fights, so it wasn't totally crazy to have, 5 events in a week within not too much travel, or sometimes even just within Boston and Cambridge and those sort of surrounding towns. Yeah, you could have 5 events in the week, and sometimes they'd overlap, sometimes not. So there was a lot of opportunity for fighters to fight a lot, and they needed to fight a lot. And a good fighter or a draw could make some good purses. And if you do really well locally, then the athletic clubs would book top fighters from elsewhere to come on in, and they would put up the money, and then you could make some good money, and you could also go travel. Other ACs, as I'll just use that shorthand, other ACs would offer money, and they would purses, and you go figure out the split and go out there and maybe post a forfeit to show you're serious. So fighters would do that sometimes, especially when the stakes were high. So if the other fighter didn't show or canceled on you, you get to keep their forfeit. And actually in 1904, Langford's manager claimed the American welterweight title for Langford, but he did it by posting hundreds of dollars. Basically, come and take the money, we're serious about it. So sometimes title claims would just happen, but, the ones that really counted, the world titles, it was a little more structured, although the weights, they could fight for the title at a weight above the title if they both agreed. And that happened in certain cases. It happened when, so Joe Gans was the reigning lightweight champion and just, considered one of the absolute top, if not the top technician and guy in the whole sport at that time, even though his weight class didn't have the prestige of the heavyweight weight class, but his ability and how much people had learned from what he was doing in his massive career, because I think he already had 134 wins when Langford faced him, and Langford was just a teenager. Now Gans had fought 6 rounds against the extremely dangerous Dave Holly the night before, and Dave Holly was like an early master of the shoulder roll. They call him the loop-de-loop puncher. So Gans fought 6 rounds against a serious world-class guy who himself was fighting an insane schedule. Dave Holly's first 6 years, 5 or 6 years, if you look at how many fights he had, it's bizarre. So Gans had fought, but Gans had done that before. In fact, Langford fought back-to-back nights himself, So this was just something that happened. Fighters were fighting so frequently, they would schedule out several fights, and you go on basically a tour of fights, So it was described in the press as a season, and it really was for a lot of guys. Not everyone, because not everyone could cut it, because it's really fierce, and it was desperate times, and it could be good money, so there was a lot at stake, and not everyone. It's not like today where people have all these sports options for these really tough characters. So this was a tough time when the best way to make money as a tough, if you're not a gangster or an enforcer, you are a boxer, you are a pugilist. Because that's how you can make some bank, and the side bets were sometimes bigger than the purses that the athletic clubs or promoters were putting up. So there was, and Joe Gans was excellent with that. He was betting a couple thousand on the side on a lot of these fights, and big money at the time. He was a big money guy. And so when Langford beat him, that was, it was a big upset. But Langford was this sort of rising force, and he'd already beaten some tough characters, and he'd beaten a lot of people up, and he'd fought at all these different athletic clubs, and fought some guys who were either names then or had been names a couple years before, because in boxing at the time, the arc of most careers was very sharp. You fight a whole bunch to get your opportunity, and then you fight what your body can take, but then once you start to get up there, it's very rare for someone to stay at the top. And that was one of the remarkable things about Langford, is for someone who fought his schedule against the level of competition that he faced in a sustained way. It's insane just how late into his career he was fighting at a world-class level. And when he wasn't fighting at a world-class level, he was fighting a silly schedule. So he was always just facing down all this adversity. But very early in his career, he showed he was very capable. And so by the end of, 1903, you have Langford having beaten the great Joe Gans, but he's also beaten the best of the local guys. Some really tough characters: Belfield Walcott, Shadow Morris, Patsy Sweeney, out of New Hampshire. Beat Joe Reed. He turned Joe Reed into a panic wrestler. He was beating him up so bad, Reed kept doing throws, and eventually he got DQ'd. And he fought multiple times against Andy Watson, who was a very scientific, fighter. And he fought Johnny Butler, who had been around. He fought John Johnson, or Jay Johnson, who had actually won at the weight class above the night that he won the amateur tournament at the Roanoke. He beat Tim Kearns, who was a local guy and had been a draw previously. Kearns had a great many fights. I think, he'd had over 60 fights at that point, and Kearns had been traveling with mixed results, and he came back. And so that was actually his first sort of big step up, and he beat him down 2 rounds, and he fought draws with Andy Watson, and Andy Watson was very, very smooth, and he was sort of the king of the draws. So Andy Watson had more draws on his record when they fought than wins and losses combined. The prearranged draw, basically, if you're both on your feet at the end of the fight, then you split the money down the middle. It's always money. So with this time, it was the reason they fought a whole bunch, the reason there were side bets, and the reason sometimes there would be prearranged draws. That was all money. And when we'd have what you call newspaper decisions, that was money in a different way. That was the authorities trying to curb betting. But they got around it because the press would then score it as though they were the judges. And so nowadays we look at sort of the majority, you look at the different newspapers just like you would a panel of judges. And that's how we often look at the newspaper decisions. And just like real life judges, the newspaper men, and depending on the region, the favorite, they had their own opinions about what constituted winning or losing rounds. But the press were very adversarial. They weren't giving out a bunch of passes at that time. So win or lose, if you showed yourself to be quality, they would call you that. But if you look bad, they would jump on you. They were very merciless. There wasn't as much fluffing going on at that time, not even nearly as much as you would see in today's boxing, where everyone's just, everyone's so great, everything's so great. No, they would be very, very ruthless, and sometimes you couldn't win. So like the Tim Kearns fight, before the fight, there was some build-up, and then he destroyed him. Then they were like, Kearns is shot. And that's just how that goes. But whether Langford just discovered him over the edge, or he's the one who punched him off the edge, who knows? Langford, let's see who else. He beat up Walter Burgo. Actually, I should mention, so Belfield Walcott, the brother of the welterweight champion, an all-time great fighter, Barbados Joe Walcott. Belfield was in the weight class below. He was a lightweight, like Langford was, although Langford was very quickly growing out of it. He's only a teenager, so by the end of the year, he was struggling to the lightweight limit. And in fact, the fight with the great Joe Gans, it became a non-title fight because he was 2 pounds over the agreed weight, which was already over the weight class limit, but they had a pre-agreement to fight at 138, and he could only make 140, so it was a non-title fight. So he beat an all-time great over 15 rounds, but he didn't get the title. You can see in the papers, it was reported the next day or the day after as he was the new champion, but then it came out about the weight, and so he did not get the belt. You know, Joe Gans' record, year-to-year record, is astonishing. And he was literally one of the best pound-for-pound fighters, you know, of his generation, if not the greatest. I mean, Langford swore that he was the greatest of all time, and Benny Leonard, who's the other chief contender for the greatest lightweight ever, also swore that Gans was the greatest ever. I mean, so when the greats are calling a certain guy the best fighter that ever lived, you know, that means a lot. So Joe Gans, you know, win over Gans was epic. So by the end of that year, he's now international news as far as the pugilistic fraternity, which was very rabid within the States. I think, I'm trying to remember, I think at the beginning of 1903, it was legal in 24 states. I think it was either at the beginning or end of 1903, but, you know, so you know, there were fights happening in private. Sometimes they make the papers, like Joe Gans had fights that were reported as it was for side bet in private. But some stuff didn't make the papers, especially if you weren't supposed to be having fights at all. So people are, even though we see these gigantic records, some of these are short 100 or more fights because we just don't have the record. We're doing what we can. And so, you know, to circle back to where Langford was just at the end of 1903, his first full season, and what a season. He had the one setback against Danny Duane, who was an excellent fighter and more experienced. He had been fighting longer. He was, you know, still a badass guy. He was a serious guy. Otherwise, you know, some guys in New York wouldn't put $500 on him if he wasn't. You know, that's a lot of money at that time. So, you know, in Langford, he didn't put up the money. His backer put up the money. And, you know, because he was fighting out of that club and then all these other clubs. And when he fought Belfield Walcott, that was a 20-round fight. I think he fought that in Rhode Island. That was over 20 rounds, you know, and he's like a teenager. He's just started. Imagine that. And Walcott was a tough proposition. You know, he had a mixed success as far as wins, losses, and lots of draws. But, you know, you see him reported in the paper. He's a tough proposition, meaning he's no easy out for anyone. He fought a lot of serious guys. And some people, if they're not the very, very best, and they fight all the serious people, they don't end up with a record. But, you know, but he was definitely a capable fighter, and Langford fighting and doing well against him had a lot to do with him getting to fight the great Barbados Joe Walcott the next year in 1904. So in his first year, he suffered a loss over 12 rounds. He didn't get finished or anything, and he's beaten the welterweight champion's brother, and he's beaten the best of the local lads. He's beaten some of the regional guys, and then he's beaten Joe Gans, and then Jack Blackburn in a prearranged draw. And there was some controversy. I think the ref, he waited until before the 12th round to tell the fighters that it would be a draw. And I think Blackburn was, you know, upset about this because he had gotten the best of it and he was fighting for points. So, you know, it's controversial, but like you see in the papers, they still reported Blackburn got the best of Langford. Draw or not, they were very, I'm telling you, they were very brutal. And it's refreshing. You know, there is some BS in the reporting, but it's very little compared to today. I mean, it's like a breath of fresh air, even though it's so many years ago. So at the end of the year, so you have Blackburn as a serious factor. Joe Gans is still Joe Gans. He still has the title. He had a tremendous record that year. It's not like that was his only fight. And I'll throw up his year-to-year record on the screen. It's quite remarkable. And so, you know, Danny Duane, he's got bragging rights, and he's had some other good opponents too. So he's had some good wins himself. I mean, lightweight was on fire. So Langford's in a wonderful position, and he only has one problem. He can't really make lightweight. He's a teenager. He's growing into his adult size. You know, and really, like, this is jumping forward a bit, but in 1906 he lost to Jack Johnson, he gave up, like, I think about 29 or 30 pounds in size to Jack Johnson, who was, top tier fighter in the world. He challenged him for the colored heavyweight title and lost, and they lost to young Peter Jackson, Sim Tompkins, who was a phenomenal fighter and should be in the Hall of Fame, and just a ferocious puncher and just very capable. And he took 5 months off, and when he came back, he had put on 10 pounds. And that's when he became an indestructible force. And that's when he was probably at his full adult height, 5'7.5". But at this point, he's still a teenager, he's still growing, so he might only be 5'7" at this point. But he's growing, he's getting his growth spurts, he's maturing into adulthood, and also he fought so much, he's making money, he can eat now. He's lived a hard life, he's a rough and tumble character, and he came from a bad situation domestically and made it out on his own as a young man. And he could fight. He could fight before he was fighting, but it was more like heart, chin, and power, natural power. And his build, he's stocky. He has a gigantic chest for his height, and he has long arms for his height, and he has a thick neck, and he has sort of a flat head. And fighters later, when he was fighting at heavyweight, and he was still only, by today's standard, he'd be like a super middleweight or something today, and walking around as a super middleweight or a light heavyweight, not even cutting weight. He's fighting guys that are 200, 220, 240, some big fellas, and he's this little short guy, but he was a little tank. Physically he was very gifted, and he learned how to use his build, and he had guidance. He wasn't just floating around either. So he's plugged in, he's got all these fights, he lives in an area, he lives in Cambridge, which is next to the city of Boston. He's got access to all this stuff. He's training, advice is coming from Georgie Byers, who's a very, very capable fighter. He'd just gotten older, and, years later they would travel together. I mean, Byers was a quality trainer, and, Langford's getting advice from Jimmy Walsh, so he's, who's a much smaller person, but very clever, very capable. And so, and he's plugged in, and once he gets going, his problem becomes he's growing in size, but that's not really like the direct problem. So he'll fight above his weight, but when he starts winning above his weight, he starts having trouble finding fights. And so, if we look at the clipping here, at the end of 1903, so he's next to, the next frame is Barbados Walcott, where he fights him in 1904. He fights Dave Holly, who gave Blackburn his first recorded loss. I mean, Holly was seriously good, gave him a lot of trouble, could fight out of a crouch, but could also fight, two-handed coming forward. He was very adaptable and hugely experienced while he was still had a young body that could take a schedule. Dave Holly's schedule is bizarre. But anyway, so Langford fought him. He's fighting at or above his weight. But if we look here, so he fights Walcott. Before too long, he's calling out Jack Sullivan and his brother to fight him on the same night. They won't fight him. And, like middleweights won't fight him when he's a welterweight. When he's a lightweight, he's fighting welterweights and middleweights. But and then it's not very many years before he'd be fighting like light heavyweights and heavyweight-sized characters, and then some of them are really big heavyweights. But just like in any era, the biggest guys aren't necessarily the best fighters, and sometimes they can't get out of their own way. So, Langford was fighting above his weight. He's not the only one. Other guys would fight. Barbados Walcott himself was scary even to some heavyweights. His body punching and his ability to fight out of a crouch and like utilize his small stature, but his powerful body. And Langford later on said that he never got hit more or hit anyone more than Joe Walcott in their fight, and which was a draw. Although a lot of people thought that Langford, deserved the win, should have been the champ, but it was a terrific fight. Langford later was very gracious about it. He said, "I was just glad to get out of there," basically paraphrasing him. But he was, because apparently Walcott had said something to him, and then later in the fight, when Langford was getting the best, he said something, whispered in his ear, and Walcott, he said, went crazy and then he was just trying to stay in there, try to survive. So he had a great deal of respect for Joe Walcott, and a lot of people did, and he was scaring even some of these heavyweights, hurting guys in sparring, and just he was just able to use his size. Langford learned a lot from that fight with Walcott in '04, and pretty soon his specialty became fighting bigger guys. And he said that the little guys were so fast, and like with Danny Dwayne, that probably came from getting his first loss from him and learning something like, oh, I see. But he had the power and he had the build, he had the arms of a big guy, but he was short, so he was like a tank turret set low, and he just learned how to do it so he could push off with one arm and then land these monster punches because his arms were normal person size, but then his head's low, so it's just a funny angle to attack someone who's expert. And so he got that in large part from Walcott, and so he's calling out the twin Sullivans. Over there on the left, Big Sandy Ferguson, he fought him too. Later, a little bit later, he'd even go up. Big Sandy wasn't considered the top heavyweight in the world. He was just, they're kind of saying, well, they didn't call him hopeless, but they were basically saying, yeah, he's not that great, but he's the best around here. Because the top heavyweights were elsewhere, but in the other weight classes, the Boston area was heavy duty. Even if some of the people weren't actually from here, they were just imports who settled here. The scene here was remarkable. And so Langford, he's, and we're going to get into this on the FightCity.com. There's going to be a lot of details. I've barely even grazed the surface, and we're 30 minutes in. So this, I just wanted to touch on a couple things, rant a little bit. I've been in the archives for weeks, and so this is just, I'm just releasing some energy and just wanted to talk a little bit about it. But, one of the things that I've been trying to do for this project is find photos in the newspapers or somewhere of all of his opponents. And it's actually, I've had some breakthroughs this week, although a couple of them I'm not sure. I'm convinced maybe they just weren't in the record in that way. They just never had the picture in the paper or whatever. So I'm doing best I can, and pretty soon I'll have them all that are out there. I'll have collected them all from the archives. And so I've got most of them already. I'm actually going to be putting some up on the screen. So by the time I'm saying this, you already know because you've been seeing them. But yeah, his rise to prominence, Langford's rise to prominence, and then his maintaining such a high level of competition is, for as long as he did, it's just silly. And the length of time that he even did it after, he was clearly past his best. He was probably starting to crest the hill, and by 1915, 16, certainly mid 1917 when Fulton smashed him up. He's definitely after that. He's now basically cycloptic. And not that long after that, he's getting a cataract in the other eye. So, by the end of his career, so far past his best, but he was still capable because he could almost fight on feel, and he had those long arms, and part of his technique was he didn't just have to fight at range. So if he could feel you, if you hit him, you're touching him. So when he get a sense of that, he could counter, and he was still knocking out people. He couldn't beat the best of the best. Harry Wills, toward the end of Langford's career, Harry Wills could consistently get the best of him because he was so far gone. And Wills was just one of the all-time great heavyweights himself. But short of certain guys could get the best of him, but most of the people he fought, he still beat them up. He still had a severe winning record. When he started, when his strength of competition dipped a little bit, his record was really good, even though he was just a ghost of his former self. He was still just world class. He was maybe just below world class, or still capable of some world class wins, because he could fight with certain style matchups, because he could fight on field, because of his build, because of how tough he was. I mean, he was made of steel, and he was fearless. So you would have to be to fight his schedule and the size differences that he often faced, and even past his prime, being the smaller guy, the shorter, lighter guy was not unusual for him. He just kept fighting at a super high level, and then way later then he would fight at a lower level, but he was still a serious guy. Just for the world-class guys, they could basically game plan the fact that he was nearly blind. But for someone who wasn't world-class, it's still a tough night. Pretty crazy stuff. But I just barely touched on 1903. There's so much in his career. This could have been a 5-hour talk on this year, because there's a context for all of those fighters he faced. I didn't even mention all of them. But, and oftentimes they have some connection to the thing. But Andy Watson was one of the key opponents, in that Andy Watson was very scientific boxer. He was actually at one point he was the boxing, they call him the professor. He was the boxing instructor at Harvard University. So, but these other guys, these are tough people. Like Stonewall Bob Allen, he'd been around, right? The people weren't sure if he was all done or whatever. Langford, fought him twice, and I think they drew, and then he won on points. I think it was 6 rounds each fight. I'll put it up on the screen, but he was a capable guy, but he wasn't at his best. But he was still a rough character, and he got shot like 4 times in the head, survived, and he took, I think, less than a year off, and he was fighting again. And another of Langford's opponents, Billy Jordan, who I think he also won over 6 rounds on points that year. Billy Jordan got shot, I think, 3 times in the stomach, and fought again, maybe a year afterwards. Although I don't think his comeback went well, because Langford was one of his opponents. So 6 rounds of Langford, and Langford was an expert body puncher. And, he was still developing at this point, but he had so much natural strength, so everything he was learning, he could apply it. And fighting all these guys, especially guys like Andy Watson, who was very clever, and then fighting, Joe Gans. I mean, he said that was the fight. He fought the best ever. And so, but then Blackburn as well, and he fought Blackburn more times than this. They fought again, several times in 04, but in 03, he got his first taste of Blackburn, and Blackburn was brilliant. Just, was adaptable. These guys were adaptable. This wasn't certain guys like Patsy Sweeney, I think he was more of a come forward fighter. He wasn't going to switch it up. Langford actually switched up, and he got the finish, I think, late in the fight. I think it was the 12th round, but Sweeney was more like, okay, we're going to have a fight. So he overcame that. I saw that mentioned in one article where they were saying he can keep Langford, it was the preview for the Gans bout. They were saying Langford can keep a cool head, and he showed in that fight with Sweeney. So he faced that kind of adversity, but he also faced, like the old school guy like Stonewall Allen, and I think John E. Butler had been around. Then he fought fellow prospects like, Johnny Johnson had won the amateur tournament the year before. Langford was in the weight class below, so they fought, and I think that was actually a draw over 6 rounds. But, so he's fought like, fellow prospect, and he beat up some other local guys, and then, the veteran Tim Kearns. But the fights with Watson was clever, so when he's facing adversity of like guys that are tough, but he's also facing very clever opponents. He's learning all of this, and it's all being translated into his very unique build. Because there aren't too many 5'7.5" guys who've got 74-inch wingspan. You don't see that a lot. So, this early in his career, he's already shown greatness, and it was only through being just growing a little bit out of his weight, his weight class, that he wasn't the lightweight champ of the world, having beaten basically one of the top guys for his poundage across the whole sport, and a guy who had a record to match and kept a schedule. I mean, he was famous for just going beating everybody up, side bets, fights in private, challenge matches. Like they were actually booked to rematch in 1904. Langford again couldn't make the 138, and so instead Gans fought a challenge match. If you can go 10 rounds, the athletic club will give you $100 a round for every round after that. And he was an overmatched opponent, but there's always ways to bet. They're always looking for ways to bet on fights. So Gans was a guy, like, he could always find a way to make a bet out of it. Made a lot of money, made an awful lot of money for that time. So Langford's built a name, and I'm not going to go into the details of his 1904 opponents in this video. But like I said, in the FightCity.com project, and I'm involved, the Langford project, I'm going to go into extreme detail and have all the clippings of the bookings and the results, and I'm going to read some of the play-by-play, or like what descriptions there were, because these early fights, they get like brief mention in the papers until you get to the, basically Tim Kearns was the first one that I saw where it had a decent write-up. You know, and he's already mentioned for having faced Andy Watson, because Andy Watson was considered a quality guy. And so, you know, and the Dwayne fight, you know, Dwayne was already an established guy, but that didn't really set him back. He had beaten the welterweight champ's brother, and, you know, Barbados Walcott at that time was much feared, and the guys his own weight weren't that keen to fight him, even though he held the title, he had the world title. So, you know, he would fight up larger men all the way up to heavyweight. And it's also make more money that way. Heavyweight was the marquee division, very much. So that's why, like, as a black man, you know, with the right manager, Barbados Walcott could get a title shot. Joe Gans, with his manager, could get a title shot. And, you know, Langford, with his manager, could get a title shot against Barbados Walcott the next year. But, you know, at heavyweight, they weren't going to let a black man fight for a title. And so Jack Johnson, he chased the Canadian champion Tommy Burns around the world, and he borrowed money from the London Athletic Club with the promise that he would defend against Langford, because this was in 1908. This was, you know, he won the title in 1908, and Langford was like considered all class at heavyweight along with Johnson, and so that was the big fight. But he chased Burns to Australia with borrowed money. He didn't end up honoring it. He didn't fight Langford after their first fight, you know, a couple years before. He never fought him again. But Langford was either the key contender or one of the handful of key contenders for all of Johnson's title reign. You know, it wasn't until 1915 when Langford started to seem mortal. You know, and the strength of competition he was facing, though, I mean, and the strength of schedule and the speed of how these fights were just machine gun schedule he was living, you know, 15, 16. I mean, they're just bizarre years. But without even getting into that, before he even got to all of that, part of the thing that makes him special is very early in his career, he's doing epic things, and he just kept doing them. So the result of that was he became the most feared fighter in history. But in spite of that, there were a lot of fearless people in boxing, especially when money's on the line and pride, and, you know, that's what they do. So he did fight a tremendous wealth of talent, but this was a very rich era, and a lot of people ducked him. So, you know, it seems like a bit of a paradox, but in an era this rich with a schedule that busy, he was able to generate probably the greatest CV of all time in boxing, but he was also avoided by a lot of people, and because he was scary. And certain guys like Gumbo Smith, you know, he said that Langford in one of their fights ruined him. He said, I was all done after that. You know, Langford ruined me. I think it was maybe their second fight, because in the first fight, if I'm not mistaken, in 1913, Gumbo got the best of him. Langford came in a little heavy, which is no excuse. You know, it's on him to not be a little bit out of shape. But Gumbo got the best of him, and when they rematched, I guess Langford really came in supreme shape and really put it on him. So I'm pretty sure that's the fight. I can't confirm that, but I know that one of their fights, Gumbo said, you know, ruined him. He kept fighting. He had lots more fights, but he took that kind of beating. So there was a practical reason that Langford was avoided, in that, like, a guy his own size, you know, there were some guys who fought him, but they were rough characters too. You know, Stanley Ketchel, to his credit, fought him. You know, Ketchel was actually like similar, like, dimensions, but except for the chest. Langford had like an enormous, the size of his chest, but the rest of their dimensions were comparable. But Stanley Ketchel had a giant set on him, so credit to him. And they fought a shorter fight, and where some thought that Langford was sort of not trying to smash him down because they were supposed to rematch on the West Coast for a big purse, and Ketchel was murdered. The fight never came together, but they were supposed to fight a long fight, you know. So Langford, sometimes he would, kind of the joke about him is that he would keep it seeming competitive sometimes to keep food on the table, you know, because he was always looking for fights. He actually had the nickname Begging Sam, because that's how avoided he was. He would go look people up, like, hey man, let's have a fight, so make some money. And people just didn't want to know. And people were writing poems about, they were writing poems about fighters ducking him. These are tough characters, but they just didn't want Langford. So credit to the people who did fight Langford. And when he got older, some people still ducked him because now they don't want to lose to a guy who's clearly past his best. So Langford was uniquely avoided, but there were some, fortunately he fought in a rich time, and there were a lot of great fighters who did get in there with him, especially, Harry Wills and Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, but other guys, Jeff Clark, and, just battling Jim Johnson. There were some big, heavy-duty characters who would take him on and go in there and do the business, but he was really scary guy. And part of the reason is he came up at the lighter weights, but he came up with speed and against quality. His escalation was very quickly. He went from fighting some local lads to suddenly, okay, you're fighting a veteran, Stonewall Allen. You're fighting that in April. You start in January you had the one fight the year before, the turned pro, take some months off. Mid-January you start off, but by April you're fighting, Johnny Johnson, Johnny Butler had been around, so Johnny Butler, Stonewall Allen, now you're fighting Andy Watson, Billy Jordan, who was very tough, Chick Monahan, Andy Watson again. Then you get the step up to the regional guy, Tim Kearns, and destroy him in 2 rounds. So now it's intense, but it's only June. It's only June, so he started properly in January. By June, it's okay, now this guy's, he fights Watson again, who gets another draw, prearranged draw, beats up Burgo. Then he loses to Danny Dwayne, but he's, he doesn't even take a month off. He fights 20 rounds against Belfield Walcott. He doesn't lick his wounds. He's just okay, keep training. Kid Griffo, Shadow Morris, Arthur Cote, then Patsy Sweeney. Patsy Sweeney was supposed to be a test, and he got through some spots because that was the fire, and then he passed that test. Then, like I said, he turned Joe Reed into a panic wrestler, and then Joe Gans. And even though Gans had fought the night before, Gans fought a crazy schedule. That's what he did, and he beat an awful lot of people doing it that way. So he took him lightly maybe, and he did try to get the rematch, but when the rematch did come and Langford was going to be 140 instead of 138, he did the challenge match instead. He went the money route, and he won. He made the money. So, it's very much a business. And Joe Gans was one of the masters, and they call him the old master, but he was in his 20s. He wasn't an old guy. He just had such experience and success, and he was so respected for his technique. People were learning from him. And he had a huge number of fights. He'd had over 150 fights when Langford fought him. So, even though there's not footage, within the thing, you can go see his fights. He's having a ton of fights. He's on the road some of the time. So, people could see and learn from technique, and they were, a lot of these gyms, they were sparring together, a lot of the top fighters. So, apparently Langford became friends with Belfield Walcott, who showed him some of the stuff that his brother, Joe Walcott, had taught him. And so he's getting tips. Georgie Byers was very good, and later, I'm not sure exactly what point he came in, but Bob Armstrong, extremely powerful fighter and a top-tier trainer, he was also in his camp. And, Langford had a structure around him. He had a great manager. And according to Langford, they had a 75-25 split. Langford made 3/4 of what he made. So, there was every incentive, and they just booked a ton of fights, and he feared nobody. He traveled, and sometimes, I've read in the thing, sometimes he'd leave so he'd go to the West Coast because he'd run out of people who were willing to fight him on the East Coast. And that's how he ended up in England the first time, because he just ran out of people who were willing to face him, because for his size, he was too scary for a lot of guys. And so, that's how he ended up at heavyweight, when he could still make, I don't know if he could have still made middleweight, but he was walking around not too far from, middleweight to light heavyweight, and he would just fight anybody of any size. And that all came from his experience at the lower weights, fighting all these different guys at this rapid pace and all these different looks, and then combining that with his build and his determination and his toughness. And and then just the increasing level of competition. So even though he only had, I think, 14 fights in 1904, that was a lot of quality fights that year, and I'll get into that on the FightCity.com project. And thanks for tuning in, listening to me rant for almost an hour. But there's a lot of information about Sam Langford, and I'm digging in the archives and just trying to share some of it. But I'm going to have more of a coherent presentation on the FightCity.com, talking about the actual clubs he fought at and who the opponents were, like what they had done, if anything, or where they were coming from. I just touched on it very briefly, here in this one. But every fighter has a story, and he had over 300 fights that we know about. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. We're going to get to all of that, but I just wanted to briefly, not even briefly, but I just wanted to rant a little bit on his sort of ascent to the world-class level, because it took about 20 months from turning pro. I think he turned pro in April. I think his one pro fight he had April 1902, and then by December he's beaten like one of the great stylists of all time. And famously so, because, Blackburn had gotten the best of him over, I think, 6 rounds, but this was a 15-round fight. And like I said, they're merciless, so the fact that Gans had fought Dave Hawley the night before, the main thing was that Langford beat him, and that gave him just this prominence. And in the countries where boxing was big, which isn't just the U.S., right? But where boxing was big and heavily covered, that's massive news. Joe Gans getting beat over 15 rounds is serious business. And so Langford, for a time there, lots of guys wanted to fight him. The year after, when he fought Barbados Walcott, lots of guys were calling him out to fight, the winner. And then when he fought Dave Hawley in their fights, people wanted to fight the winner to get a path to the title. But it wasn't too many years before no one his size, very few people his own size were willing to fight him, because he was too much. But, for a few years, he had some willing participants. So what we see as the years go by is he doesn't repeat, 1903. He doesn't go out there 27 times, in these coming years, but he has slightly less fights, still a great deal of fights year to year, monthly, maybe you could think of it, but he's fighting at a higher level in general. But you start to see it distill out, where some of the men, especially like even powerful fighters his own size, they don't want anything to do with him, or like with Ketchel, like later, these are later years, but Ketchel fought him, but he, it was a shorter rounds and a no decision state, meaning, if you're both standing at the end, then no decision is rendered. It's the betting thing with the authorities. And so, and he went the distance with Ketchel in a shorter fight, but then the big fight on the other coast didn't materialize for him, which is a shame, because he was the best middleweight in the world. I mean, he was the best at several weights in the world at the same time, according to a lot of people. Certainly, 6-7 years into his career, he's considered, like, by some as the absolute top guy. Maybe him and Johnson, because Johnson had a size advantage and was a brilliant fighter himself, especially at shutting people down. Once he got his style down properly. So there were questions about that, but with most of the other guys, it was just questions who's willing to fight Langford. And some of these guys, some of his great rivals as heavyweights, they were still bigger than him, and he was just that good that he fought that much at heavyweight and kept the kind of record that he did and the schedule that he did. It's truly remarkable. He really stands out, even amongst those great fighters who do stand out. There are a few guys where you can look at their year to year and just be that astonished. There are people who kept great records and at a high level, but Langford just really he's just on this tier, practically by himself. And you can see it early in his career. He was fearless. He's fighting, world-class guys. In his first 2 full seasons, he fights 2 pound-for-pound greats, all-time greats, Joe Walcott and Joe Gans. He's still a teenager. He's not even a grown man. He's fighting at that level. He's fighting very, very experienced all-time greats and getting the best of both of them. Although the first one, it wasn't a title shot, but he got the win over 15 rounds. And with Walcott, I had a terrific battle and it was for the championship of the world, but it was a draw. So, and he didn't get a world title shot after that one against Walcott, but he fought for the color title and he had tremendous success, the color champion, which was reported in the press. It's a real thing. It's not like people after the fact are making that up. It was in the papers where they mentioned, like I said, the heavyweight is the marquee division. So they mentioned the heavyweight champion, meaning the white champ. Then they mentioned who the colored heavyweight champ is. So 1902 to 1903, I think I saw an article early 1903. They're talking about the championships that changed hands. I'll see if I can dig it up and throw it up there. They're talking about, they list the heavyweight champ, then they talk about the colored heavyweight title changing hands, and then for the other divisions, they just list the world title. So it was something set apart, and Langford had a tremendous record as the colored heavyweight champ and took over as the champ when Jack Johnson wouldn't defend it. When Jack Johnson beat Tommy Burns in 1908 and he was now the world champ, he wasn't going to go fight for the colored championship. So other guys were fighting for it. Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, primarily. Harry Wills himself was very powerful in that regard later. But so Langford's taking this inordinately high level of competition. His career starts to boil down to less fights, but high level fights. And so he's not fighting like the, Stonewall Allens, like the guys who are his size or smaller than him and old. Like he's fighting some really scary dudes and making a lot of them look average if he's not trying to carry them. And it was a very rich era. So he had there were a lot of venues. There were a lot of people putting money up. It was a live gate era. So purses were being put up because that's what you get, the patrons to buy memberships to the athletic club or tickets to the fight sometimes. And in certain jurisdictions you couldn't sell tickets to a fight, so they had an athletic club. You're just a member of the club and they put on fights. So that was like an end run around legislation, because boxing was under threat from legislation at this time. And 1904, Boston shut down, the clubs shut down. So the scene, Langford was fighting more regionally, but he was fighting a lot. He was keeping a crazy schedule, and he was fighting some deadly guys in there. Not every single person, but a lot of these fights were super, super high level, and he's learning all the time, and he's still growing into his adult size. And it's like the end, November 1906, when he gets up, like I think it was 154 maybe when I could be wrong. He might have gone up in the 160s and I'm just misremembering. I'm really focused on the early part of his career right now. But he, then when he's full size, he's already fought a Hall of Fame career. And then he goes on a run, 35 fights unbeaten, loses one fight to, I think, Fireman Jim Flynn, and then goes another 21 fights unbeaten. That was the kind of, in just several years, that was the kind of what happened when Langford hit his full size. But he's learning this whole time, and just like I've briefly outlined in his 1903, his first full season, that was a real season. That was a great season. Not the greatest year of all time, but that's certainly an honorable mention. To so quickly fight a guy, Joe Gans, who, Blackburn got the best, and Blackburn was phenomenal himself, but in the recent path that Gans had walked, Blackburn was the only guy to get the best of him. That was a recent development. And Gans wasn't done. He went back to his top form. Like it wasn't like he was over, even though he had so much experience. He was still the top guy. But Langford outgrew the division, so when he's as a full adult, he's outside that weight class. He wasn't going to make lightweight again. So he's fighting middleweight. He's fighting guys who are light heavyweight sized and light heavyweights, and he's fighting heavyweights, and all this experience of the lower weights and seeing all these different looks, but not in a weight class where you can get knocked out by getting caught as easily as heavyweight. That really helped him. So he had the experience of a lighter weight fighter, but he's built like a tank, and he's fighting these giants who are a little bit slower. They may be tougher and hit harder, but they're slower, and so he really had all the physical advantages, the long arms and the short stature and the experience against great crouching fighter, especially, Joe Walcott, that he could fight out of a crouch, come in, just crush the body, crush the head. I mean, he was just a powerhouse for such a small guy. I mean, Joe Walcott was 5'1.5", so he was even shorter than Langford. And when they fought, Langford was coming up to welterweight, so like Walcott was thick, you know, for his height, and he used it to his advantage. And so, you know, Langford proved his class at the lower weights against speed and technique, like especially Gans. You know, and that wasn't his last fight with Blackburn. That was just, you know, part of his first full season. He just got his first one in with Blackburn over 12 rounds. But all those rounds against Andy Watson and all these other different guys, you know, and even facing adversity down against Patsy Sweeney, who was a rough character and had a lot of wins. I think he had almost 50. I think he had 48 wins at that point, 21 draws and then 10 or 11 losses. You know, he had a great deal of fights. Come forward guy. He got through that. So Langford's proven his toughness as well as he's proven his technique, and he's learning from Walsh and Byers, and so he becomes a powerhouse and a really feared fighter and respected fighter. And even though he didn't get a chance at the world title, I mean, he was world famous in, you know, in the sporting realm. I mean, because he was just, there were lots of iconic boxers. You know, it was a big deal at the time, but he became one of those guys, like where he's a force of nature. And so in this FightCity.com project, at first I'm going to focus heavily on his early years. I'm really fascinated about his rise. I'm fascinated by his rise to prominence. And so that's going to take a while. Eventually I'm going to get to the later career and maybe just do some one-off, you know, pieces about articles or certain one-off fights. But generally I'm just focusing on this rise because all of this experience informed his eventual badassery. And that's what's really fascinating to me, is like what created, separate from the rough childhood and being out on his own and being a rough and tumble guy, you know, who liked to fight. He was losing jobs for fighting, according to him. But then also landing at a good gym and being trained by quality fighters and having a manager who's experienced in the game, as having, you know, run an athletic club. So when the club closed, when the Lenox club closed, you know, eventually he became his manager in that, and they worked well together. They got a lot of fights. He had connections. He managed to get him fights in, you know, around the world, like Langford did travel. But we're going to get to all of that, because I'm going to go really in depth, but I'm trying to do a very precise sort of breakdown of his first few years, you know, and even that is a pretty heavy-duty task, because there's a lot of information. I go through, you know, well, I'll just put it this way. I looked at about 200 articles, probably 200 pages of newspaper to find searches to find a picture of Joe Reed from 1903. Fought him in November. I think that was actually his last fight before he fought Joe Gans. But I just went through, and it took hours, you know, or at least an hour, hour and a half, I'm not even sure. I just zone out and do it, but I found it. I found the picture. I'm going to put it up on the screen right now. But I'll put it up on the screen in post, of course. I'm just ranting at my phone. I'm gonna go in and put in as many photos as I can find. But anyway, I've been talking for over an hour. I appreciate anyone who's made it this far. This is just a little, not even a teaser. This is just me ranting about something I've spent a great deal of time on, which is just researching Langford. And I'm not really talking from notes here, so if I made any mistakes, that's just sleep deprivation and absent-mindedness. But to the best of my recollection, all those fighters I mentioned, those were from his 1903, his debut year, and I will put it up after the fact. I'll stick up his schedule. So it's a remarkable, you know, I call it a rookie year. I mean, he did fight the year before, the one fight, but considering the speed of his schedule, this is really his restart, his reset. This is when he was really off to the races, and he certainly was, you know, 27 fights in those 12 months. That's pretty heavy duty, and it just gets crazier from there. This was not his craziest year. This is not even close to his craziest year. I'm not sure. Maybe at some point I'll do a video ranking the difficulty of schedule for the years that he fought. From 02 to 26, I'll rank the top 10 hardest years. And even that would be hard to rank. I mean, they were all tough. until the last handful of years, they were all tough years. So we're going to get into that. So thanks for tuning in. I'm going to cap it now at about 65 minutes. That's brutal. And yeah, so look for stuff coming on thefightcity.com. I'm going to probably do some more rants and put them up, here on my YouTube channel. But have a great day, everybody. Questions in the comment section, or advice, or anything, corrections, have at it. And thanks for tuning in. Take care.